Can you see my screen now?
I can. Thank
Great.
you. Just to remind before we begin, the paper itself is being recorded. If you would prefer not to be seen, just turn off your video camera. I will turn the recording off for discussion. It's my pleasure to welcome Ela, a research associate of the Margaret Beaufort Institute. Ela is a biblical scholar with a background in literary studies, specialising in the Hebrew Bible. She is currently working on a number of projects in the field of biblical reception, including the typological exegesis in medieval sermons, prophetic aspects of contemporary art, and new vision of biblical formation in the Catholic Church. Her contribution, entitled Davidic Narratives in the Contemporary Roman Catholic Liturgical Readings, will soon be published in a volume of essays dedicated to the figure of David in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. She is based in Warsaw, Poland. Ela, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ferdia, and thank you everyone for trusting me and choosing the Gospel of Play over the Gospel of Suffering in the parallel room. Right, now I will need to figure out how to, okay, that's how I do it. Okay, well, Kate Clanchy, who is a contemporary British poet, author, and teacher, claims that all great literature is subversive. This formula certainly does not work both ways. Not all subversive literature is great. But the stories and novels written by the Swedish author Astrid Lindgren and intended primarily for children have a strong subversive strand running through all of them, and at the same time can be counted among great literary achievements, certainly not only for children. Lindgren's work resists being categorized as devotional. Anyone who has read her most famous book, the Pippi Longstocking trilogy, will see that this is a mild understatement. Nevertheless, the influence of biblical stories and motifs in a number of her books is clear, important, and intrinsically connected with the subversive strand. In this short paper, I will only be able to discuss 2 cases of biblical reception in Lindgren's books. I will argue that in the second one, Lindgren reveals something of her own relationship with biblical texts. And I will try to demonstrate some of the benefits of the model she represents. Even though Lindgren's literary debut didn't come until she was 37 years old, she became the author of over 100 books, including novels, plays, essays, and memoirs. She also participated in creating feature films, animations, and radio productions based on her novels and stories, and collaborated with the best artists and illustrators of her time. Late in life, she was also an outstanding and influential public figure, making substantial contributions to the debates and occasionally even legislation on children's and animal rights, on war and nonviolence, and various cultural issues. In 1976, she contributed to the downfall of the Swedish government with her poignant pamphlet on tax policy. And I quoted from Maria Nikolaeva's work on Astrid Lindgren. Lindgren was also a philanthropist, generously supporting causes connected with children's welfare. Lindgren's funeral on March the 8th, 2002, was attended by feminists with children and grandchildren, the Swedish Prime Minister, several generations of the royal family, and 100,000 ordinary Swedes who lined the streets. One of the awards and scholarships established in her honor includes the prestigious International Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award for Literature, comparable in monetary value to the Nobel Prize. Lindgren's books have been translated into 107 languages, according to her official website, dedicated to her memory, from Afrikaans through Elfadian, Frisian, and Scottish Gaelic to Zulu. But her reception is not uniform worldwide. In some countries, her books are library staples. This, of course, includes her native Sweden, as well as Denmark, Norway, and other Scandinavian countries, Germany, and the former USSR, as well as other post-communist countries in Eastern and Central Europe. At the same time, in other parts of the world, she is virtually unknown or associated only with one of her heroines, the main character in the most often misunderstood and misinterpreted book series, Pippi Longstocking. Currently in Poland, we are witnessing a new wave of her reception thanks to a series of audiobooks recorded by a popular actress and Lindgren's fan. It is through listening to these audiobooks together with my children many times, very many times, very, very many times, that I encountered some of her characters afresh, and some for the first time, as a number of books were translated into Polish after I left the group of their target readership, or so I thought. Since this encounter, I became fascinated by Lindgren's personality and oeuvre. More relevant for the present paper is my discovery of the importance of biblical stories in her books. So not only was Lindgren a prolific, famous, and influential writer, but she was also one of a remarkable literary skill. In her work, she used a number of literary genres, including a story, fairy tale, folk and literary, myth, ideal, folk song, epistolary novel, fantasy, and other, mixing them, testing their capacity, and yes, playing with them. One of her favorite artistic tools was intertextuality, including allusions to books such as Anne of Green Gables, Mark Twain's novels, numerous adventure books, Shakespeare's Henry VI and Romeo and Juliet, Agatha Christie, and biblical stories. The Protestant canon of biblical texts in Swedish translation was part and parcel of her cultural background. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century into a family of tenant farmers in southern Sweden. Her mother, and I quote her biographer, was a pious, deeply religious woman, the ever vigilant moral guardian of Astrid Lindgren's childhood home, where the 4 children had to attend Sunday school and church going was mandatory. I don't know yet of what text exactly Lindgren's private canon within canon consisted. However, her biographer Jens Andersen mentions that 6 Bibles stood on the bookshelf above her bed in the apartment in Stockholm, where she lived most of her adult life. And one of the books she most often returned to was Ecclesiasticus. Andersen mentions several references to Ecclesiasticus in Lindgren's letters and picks up a linguistic allusion to this book in her children's novel Seacrow Island, written in 1964. I will return to this particular book in a moment. The question remains whether Lindgren read Bible as scripture. I would venture that most probably not. She often acknowledged the Christian legacy of her childhood home, but she distanced herself from religious belief. However, her position was neither hostile nor atheistic, and perhaps can be best described as agnostic. In this paper, I argued that while Lindgren was, for good personal reasons, openly critical of shallow, empathy-less moralism associated with religiosity, the Bible, or at least a selection of biblical texts, was nevertheless one of her most important literary influences, with which she continued to seriously engage throughout her life, reading it as a subversive text carrying existential truth and freedom. Now, turning to particular texts. Reading the Bible with Pippi Longstocking. The Pippi Longstocking trilogy, a set of texts which sets the tone of Lindgren's big literary project, echoes a biblical motif, in my opinion, echoes a biblical motif without openly referring or alluding to the scriptural text. Pippi Longstocking is a 9-year-old superhumanly strong redhead whose mother died when she was a baby, and her father, a sea captain, has seemingly vanished at sea. She moves into a house by herself, known as Villa Villekula, located in a little Swedish village. Her only companions are her pet monkey, Mr. Nilsson, and her unnamed pet horse. She has with herself a suitcase filled with pieces of gold. Pippi soon befriends her two local children, siblings named Annika and Tommy, who admire her and enjoy her company. Together, they experience countless adventures set in the familiar local surroundings and, in one of the installments of the book, on an exotic island. Throughout the years, stories about Pippi accumulated a considerable amount of critical literature. Her origins in fairy tale or myth and affinity with the alien child, such as Peter Pan or the Little Prince, a character whose ontological status is unclear and obscure, have been explored. Pippi is from the very outset put in the position of power. She is independent, parentless, physically strong, lives on her own, has access to material resources. Moreover, she does not develop, since she is, like Mary Poppins, perfect from the beginning. Rather than being the main character, she acts as a catalyst. Her role is to set the plot in motion. But what is the purpose of the plot? In short, Pippi enters Tommy and Annika's lives as an otherworldly agent of change, who through linguistic operations questioning the symbolic order, expressed in elaborate linguistic humor, and through her norm-breaking behavior, teaches them to question the normativity of adulthood and the resulting power relations. The oppressive structure of power relations between adults and children is, of course, in constant shift. It is perpetuated as children absorb their parents' models and standards of parenting. As Pippi points to Tommy and Annika, of course, you have to eat your good cereal. If you don't eat your good cereal, then you won't grow and get big and strong. And if you don't get big and strong, then you won't have the strength to force your children when you have some to eat their good cereal. Unlike Pippi, Tommy and Annika will eventually grow up. However, Pippi's questioning of normativity has a transformative effect on them. They become capable of questioning norms. In Nikolaeva's words, so will the young readers. And so have too several generations of readers all over the world, inspired and enthused by Pippi, but not to misbehave as many educators have feared, but to be critical, inquisitive, and imaginative. They have learned that social rules and laws are not absolute. The carnival is over, but its subversive effect will indeed last forever. End of quote. Externally, the world remains as it is. The rules are questioned rather than disregarded. By a deep inward transformation has occurred in the characters and in the readers. Further research is needed in order to trace all the sources which influence Lindgren's views on childhood. They certainly include the classic Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Ellen Key, a feminist Swedish writer 2 generations Lindgren's senior. But while there are no references to the Bible in the Pippi trilogy, and I haven't been able to identify any allusions to it, the idea of questioning the normativity of childhood strongly resonates with Matthew 18, 2-3. He called a child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." There is no definite interpretation of this parable, as there shouldn't be. However, the questioning of the normativity of adulthood is clear enough. At the same time, even though I'm unable to indicate a citation or allusion in Lindgren's text, so a direct connection is unclear, I suggest that Lindgren's first-hand engagement with Matthew 18 especially with verse 3, was one of the experiences which formed Lindgren's thinking in questioning the normativity of adulthood and a liberating, transformative power of such an operation. In one of her other books, there is a child character named Emil, who, unlike the grown-ups, paid attention in church. What he heard inspired him to orchestrate a subversive reenactment of the gospel parable of the feast. At the same time, in one of her letters to young readers, Lindgren remarked, "There is no other child that could inspire me other than the child I myself once was." Combining these observations, I envisage Lindgren as such a diligent and imaginative listener, reader of a biblical text, including Matthew 18. But even the prospect of the discussed connection between the subversive and questioning the normativity of adulthood, Pippi, and the gospel invites us to rethink Jesus's advice to the disciples. Perhaps the emphasis is not on, as it has been argued, adopting the innocence, status, or vulnerability of children, but rather their perspective. To enter the kingdom of heaven, you must have the imagination, the priorities, the playfulness of children, or you must have the same disregard for authority or obliviousness to convention that at least some children do. I'll return to this in a moment, connecting it with the issue of a proposed model of relationship with biblical text. Due to time constraints, I cannot discuss here the many examples of direct references or strong allusions to biblical texts in Lindgren's other books. I will move on to the scene in which we actually witness someone reading a biblical passage. It comes from the book entitled Secro Island, published in 1964, which I already mentioned. The story is set contemporaneously in an idyllic small island on Stockholm archipelago. The plot centers around the Stockholm-based family of Melker Melkersson, a widowed writer and father of 4, who one summer rents an old farmhouse, Carpenter's Cottage. During a number of stays there at various times of year, the children and their father experience adventures, share in the local friends' fortunes and misfortunes, and become members of the community. One of the book's main characters is Pelle, the youngest of Merkel's children. Pelle's mother died at childbirth 7 years earlier, and his eldest sister, 19 years old Malin, plays the role of his mother figure. Pelle, a dreamer, animal lover, and melancholic little boy, the most individualized and deepened of the characters in the book, and perhaps even all of Lindgren's child characters, is longing for stability and security, endangered in his view by Malin's numerous suitors. The scene, which seems to allow us a glimpse of Astrid as the reader of the Bible, is included in the chapter entitled Operation Moses. It is part of the subplot connected with a rescued baby seal unexpectedly gifted to a local girl called Tjorven by its finder, a fisherman called Westerman. The seal is named Moses for being rescued from the water. When Westerman senses that there might be money to be made from selling Moses, he revokes the gift he gave to Tjorven. The scene I will discuss now is set as Tjorven and Pelle creep to the Westerman's garden at night to steal Moses back from the men's boathouse. To the children's unpleasant surprise, Westerman's wife turns out not to be asleep. Rather, she appears in the open window, lights the oil lamp on the table, and starts to read aloud to herself something that, and I quote, sounded like something out of the Bible, end of quote. The mortified children are hiding under a lilac bush outside the window and listen. After she finished reading, she puts out the lamp and shuts the window. Operation Moses can resume. The way in which this short scene is constructed indicates that it is a description of Pelle's inward process, a spiritual experience. There is a clear symbolic frame of the light being lit and then put out. The narrator emphasizes that this was a June night in a Nordic country. So the lighting of the light inside the house has an additional meaning than just functional. The open window can be seen as an indication of an opening of a deeper connection with self. Pelle enters into a dreamlike state from which he has to be woken up by Tjorven poking him, and then the window being loudly slammed shut. Pelle's individual participation in this experience is emphasized by Tjorven's impatience at Mrs. Westermann's choice of the reading material. The girl would have prepared something out of the daily paper. Pelle's inward process is triggered by the words which, as I have mentioned, sounded like something out of the Bible. And I quote again, she, Mrs. Westermann, had a monotonous voice, but she read without hesitation, and Pelle listened. Suddenly, there came some words which stood out from all the other meaningless ones and began to shine, as words could shine for him sometimes. End of quote. Clearly, it wasn't the first of Pelle's encounters with meaningful words, and his sensitivity to this kind of communication perhaps shouldn't surprise us, considering his father's literary profession. We don't know what words had shone for him before. The words which moved him so much on this occasion were the following ones. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. He does not listen further, just murmurs them silently to himself and enters into a particular process of interpretation. The uttermost parts of the sea is the carpenter's cottage on Seacrow Island, the place where you wanted to be when you were at home in the town, that is in Stockholm, where he normally resided. Throughout this text, through this text, encountered in this particular moment and recognized as something out of the Bible, Pelle connects with uttermost longing, being properly at home in the place in which he feels he belongs, surrounded with friends, nature, and his beloved animals. He goes on to imagine, if only one had the wings of the morning and could fly there across the water, how wonderful that would be. The motif of flying, this ultimate human fantasy, is present in Lindgren's other books as well, but here it is not a purpose in itself. Flying would serve the purpose of reaching the dwelling, the carpenter's cottage. Pelle doesn't hear the words that precede and follow this verse, but any person familiar with Psalm 139, from which this verse is taken, knows them well, as must have Astrid Lindgren. The psalm speaks of God's deep and intimate knowledge of the psalmist, about the intimate relationship between them. And the next verse, verse 10, expresses faith that even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. In the concluding chapters of the book, Pelle, transformed and empowered by this experience of deep connection with his needs and wants, puts all his resourcefulness and courage into independent and brave actions within the scope of realistic powers of a child, aimed at securing, with Tjorven's help and the cooperation of the universe, this dwelling for himself and his family. And he succeeded. This all works out fine. Pelle's reader response engagement with a biblical passage sets in him in motion an important inward process. The lesson from reading the Bible with Pelle is consistent with Lindgren's empathic and serious view of a child and of childhood, not as a prelude to life, but as a real and fully valuable and multi-dimensional stage in life. But Pelle is not the only person in this scene who was moved by the words of the psalm. Mrs. Westermann pauses and sighs after reading verse 9 of the psalm. We don't know much about this woman, but from one short passage earlier in the book, we can infer that she is an overburdened, lonely woman married to a social outcast. Her language suggests that she is imaginative and has a lot of empathy towards her difficult husband. It is possible that her reaction to the psalm passage is similar in spirit to Pelle's, albeit with opposite vector. Perhaps she wishes she could take the wings and fly to the uttermost parts of the sea, away from the contained space of her house and the island, where her life and social interactions are limited. Does she find consolation in the next verse of the psalm? We do not know. The open window by which she reads suggests longing for freedom, which reading the psalm seems to release. But eventually she stands by it in darkness and then shuts it. If we take Mrs. Westermann's perspective, the scene is a melancholic one, reflecting Lindgren's own personal struggles at that time, testified by the references to Ecclesiastes mentioned in her letters and also in the same book. But I suggest that we might look at the scene of the psalm reading from yet another angle, as a key to understanding Lindgren's own relationship with biblical literature. As is the case with all great authors, Lindgren's imagination was permeated with literature, by literature with which she engaged, and her own imaginative literary work was permeated with her experience of life. Her experience as a reader informed and shaped the book she authored. I hope to have demonstrated that biblical literature was an important component of this hermeneutical circle or spiral in which life and imagination, nourished by literature, fed back to new literature. This circle, in turn, sets in motion new hermeneutical circles or spirals in her readers, who authored their own lives and perhaps their own books. References to or echoes of biblical texts in Lindgren's work are connected with a particular kind of change or transformation, a liberating and often subversive passage from evil to goodness and love, from oppression and injustice to freedom and justice, from confusion to insight, from powerlessness to agency. Pippi, inspired perhaps by Matthew 18:3, questions the normativity of adulthood and transfers to her friends the liberating effect of such questioning. Lindgren's other child characters, for example, Emil and Madiken, demonstrate the transformative power of imaginative transtextual play with biblical stories. Pelle's reading of the passage from the Psalm describes an empowering spiritual process experienced by a child. I argued that the analyzed scene from the Sycro Island, with all the necessary caveats, can serve as a model of this hermeneutical system, in which Mrs. Westermann represents Lindgren as an engaged reader of a biblical text, while Pelle represents her readers, witnessing her reading a biblical text and experiencing their own transformative hermeneutical processes. Theology has various names for passages and transformations of this kind, but I'm consciously avoiding them. I have already stressed that Lindgren's work is not confessional. However, through it, readers, children, and adults can experience the transformative, liberating, and subversive power of the story and its vehicle, literature. If I was to introduce a theological category into this study, it would be that of inspiration. I have already used the word inspired several times in this paper, but in the general sense of literary influence. In his reframing of biblical reception from the perspective of Catholic theology, Gerald O'Collins discusses a domino effect of biblical inspiration. inspired biblical texts inspire authors of new inspiring texts, which in turn inspire their readers. I believe this is the case with reception of biblical texts in Lindgren's work. Indeed, the word of God is living and active. Moving to conclusion. In September 2019, some of us and a number of other scholars and practitioners took part in a symposium dedicated to new vision of biblical formation in the Catholic Church and beyond. Concluding this paper, I'd like to think about the implications of a new Lindgrenian or Lindgrenesque interpretation of Matthew 18:3. Think about the implications such an interpretation may have for our understanding of what the relationship with biblical texts may look like and what biblical formation may be like. Unless you change and open yourselves to the imagination, the playfulness of children, you will never really meet God in Scripture. Can we try to imagine the meaning of this passage in such a way? And what do children naturally do? They explore and play. So let's imagine for a moment that instead of being entitled Introduction to Poetry, the following poem is entitled Introduction to Biblical Exegesis. I wonder who the implied speaker may be. Now, I must admit that as a biblical scholar, I am biased. I have witnessed more text beating than an average person, and also more than I can bear anymore. However, I certainly do not suggest abandoning intellectual components of biblical formation programs. Quite to the contrary, I'm all for teaching everyone about historical context, literary genres, history of exegesis, etc. But maybe there is an alternative to the interrogative model of reading, including questions such as, what does it really mean? Or at best, what is God telling me through this today? What if for a change, readers tried to enjoy the biblical texts, experiment with them, play with them, experience them, admire them, be horrified with them? Perhaps that is how they may be transformed by them. Astrid Lindgren's example seems to suggest it may work. Thank you.